All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us during the Lytham Partners Spring 2022 Investor Conference. My name is Robert Blum, Managing Partner of Lytham Partners. Up next here, we have a panel presentation, which we hope you'll find insightful, titled Emissions Reduction Technologies to Meet Net Zero Targets. We have two panel participants that can each provide their own unique perspective on the topic that are addressing these challenges from a couple of different angles. But before we begin some of the conversation here, for those that are not familiar, Lytham Partners is one of the country's leading investor relations firms with more than 2 decades of corporate access experience. We've built one of the industry's most diverse and effective platforms for connecting small companies with highly qualified and focused institutional investors, while also creating a framework of best practices in various aspects of investor relations. And hopefully today's panel is another example where we can bring some value to multiple constituents. So, with that being said, let's sort of have some introductions made. Peter, can I first have you introduce yourself to the audience and maybe provide just a brief bit of background on yourself and maybe a very high level on the Pontech.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks for inviting us to be a part of this panel. I really appreciate it. My name is Peter Howard. I am the VP of Project Development at Pond Technologies, and that means that I am the person who is interfacing with various people who emit carbon dioxide emissions, but don't just want to abate those emissions, actually want to transform them into something useful. So Pond Technologies is set up as a tech development company. And what we do is we have the technology to transform your carbon dioxide, your greenhouse gas emissions, into a product that has value.
Perfect. And thank you for that, Peter. Jeff, maybe if you could kindly do the same.
Well, thanks, Robert. And Peter, glad to meet you both. My name is Jeff Allison. I'm the president of Delta Cleantech, and I'm very pleased to be here today. Delta Cleantech is a company that's been around for about 17 years, and we're one of the leaders in post-combustion CO2 capture. And post-combustion is a method that captures CO2 from the flue gas from any large emitter of CO2. And we use a technology that's been around for many years, amine capture technology. And we use that technology with our own individual patented processes that we've used to improve the process. And we've tried to turn it into a commercial product now that's ready to go. So if you're a large commercial emitter and you want to reduce your emissions, we can go anywhere from 1 ton a day to up to 7,000 tons a day of CO2. And so basically our slogan is that every smokestack in the world is our potential market. And we believe we've got a large potential market for our company.
Fantastic. Let's, Peter, let's sort of start off at a high level here, if we could. Carbon capture and utilization, CCU or CCSU, sort of including the word storage in there. I think is a term that's gained some increased discussion here of late. For those that are new to the concept, help to educate us just a little bit more and expand upon those concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you are emitting CO2 emissions, the typical approach is to try and reduce those emissions as much as possible. And that's a really great approach. So you can try and have more efficient equipment. You can try and recover waste heat. There's all sorts of technologies you can use to try and reduce your CO2 emissions that go up the stack. But you likely can't reduce them to zero. So it doesn't matter how efficient your boiler is, you're still going to have to burn fuels to make heat to run your processes. And that means that you're not going to be able to reduce your CO2 emissions to a zero level. You're going to be able to reduce them as much as possible, but there's still going to be some there. So the concept behind carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, is that those remaining emissions, what if you could capture them and do something useful with them? So in other words, give them value. So you can either just capture the CO2 directly, or you can actually try and transform chemically the CO2 into something else. So that might be carbonates, or in the case of Pond Technologies, that might be algae biomass, which can then be used for a variety of human food and animal feed ingredients, as well as fertilizers and some other interesting applications as well.
Jeff, maybe transitioning here, what are the key factors that are driving this concept? I mean, obviously there's sort of cleaner air and some of the things that Peter just mentioned, but, is this an economic driven solution, or is this being driven by government mandates, for instance?
Well, Robert, a few years back, there was a movie called The Inconvenient Truth that came out, which initially drove the CO2 business and reduction. And unfortunately, with the world financial crisis, sort of all the initiatives that were going on with emissions reduction sort of got shelved. What's changed this time is that, particularly in Canada, there's been a change in government policy. For example, the carbon tax has been introduced, which has been a major driver. I mean, it's almost like a carrot and stick situation, whereby the carbon tax right now is about $50 a ton, and it's going to be going to about $130 a ton by 2030. So all of the emitters in Canada are sort of looking at, their emissions profiles, and they're doing a lot of research as to, what kinds of ways can they reduce their emissions. And more important question is, what are they going to do with the CO2 once they've captured it? And, Peter's technology is one among many that can try to use CO2 and turn it into a commercial product. And so what that effectively does is, if you have a way that you can convert your CO2 into a commercial commodity or product, you effectively can reduce the cost to capture, number one. And the way you do that is by selling it as a commercial commodity. And the second thing is you reduce your carbon tax. So in some cases, you can actually make money by capturing CO2. And those are the kinds of opportunities that we're looking for as a company right now. There's also the other factor that goes into that, which is called identity preserved waste. And that's the fact that, you used to be able to take your waste and put them underground and sort of say, well, we put it underground, so it doesn't matter anymore. It's out of our hands. And what the governments and other investors are saying, no, that's not the case anymore. You're responsible for your waste, which includes air waste and sequestration waste. And as a result, what's happening now is that, people are looking for a commercial solution. So, if you can convert your CO2 into a usable product like Peter's or one of the other ones, there's many other ones, like I said, on the market right now. That's what they're looking for, and that's what's driving the industry.
So maybe, Peter, to that point, let's sort of try to quantify this a little bit if we can. What do you see as the size of the market opportunity here, given some of the things that were just mentioned?
Yeah. So, if you look at various market research reports, the market size is probably somewhere on the order of $10 billion within the next 5 or so years. Personally, I think that's a bit of an understatement. So as Jeffrey said, there's a bit of a perfect storm happening right now. So let's say you're a cement plant or a steel mill or an oil refinery or any other heavy emitter who has substantial CO2 emissions. Say you're covered by the federal government's emissions trading scheme. You're in a tough spot. More and more financiers, so these are private equity funds as well as pension funds and banks, are committing to net zero targets and to decarbonizing their investment portfolios. There's now standards around measuring that. Things like the PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, as well as the International Sustainability Standards Board, run by the IFRS Foundation. So increasingly, all of these companies that emit large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions are going to have to be transparent about how much they're emitting investors are going to make decisions based on those numbers. And at the same time, you've got this policy that's increasingly making your emissions more and more costly. So you're getting pressure from your investors, you're getting pressure from your stakeholders, you're getting people talking to you about carbon risks, and you're getting a pressure from government policyholders as well. So you're in a tough spot if you're an emitter. And if a technology like Delta Cleantech or Pond Technologies can come around and take your CO2, and as Jeffrey says, in the right conditions, we can actually make money from your CO2 and give you a little slice of that money-making opportunity as well. So if we can all make money reducing our CO2 emissions while everyone's getting all these pressures to have to disclose and report and understand and control your emissions, I mean, why wouldn't you? So from that perspective, a $10 billion market estimate for me seems actually small. There's roughly 700 large emitters of CO2 emissions in Canada. There's roughly 11,000 in Europe. There's a similar number, sort of 10 to 15,000 in the US. If those guys can all emit their somewhere around 20-ish trillion tons of CO2, and they can start to get paid to reduce that, this is a massive market opportunity.
Yeah, Jeff, are you sort of seeing the same thing from your perspective as well, especially as it relates to the investors, right? I mean, this is an investor conference. To what extent are we seeing the investor community driving the acceleration and requiring these corporations to be held accountable for their processes?
Well, we're absolutely seeing that, and it's probably the busiest we've ever been in our 17 years in business. They've actually defined that term, and they call it ESG, or environmental and social governance. And that's a new buzzword that's being used in Toronto and New York and London. And really what that says is that if you're in Canada, for example, and you're your teacher's pension fund, and you want to make an investment and it's an oil company, they would go to that oil company and they would say, what is your ESG plan? And if they don't have a plan, then they're not going to invest. Also, the existing investors are saying, what is your ESG plan? So, these are formal commitments. Like if some of the 5 largest companies in the world stand up and say, we're going to be net zero by 2030, then they have a culpable liability now that they've stated that if you invest in our company, we're going to be net zero. So if you can't meet that objective, then there's potential legal liability, let alone the fact that people won't invest in your company. So all of these factors coming together is really what's driving that. Now, there's a lot of people, a lot of companies, I should say, that are kicking tires right now in this whole area. But as this progression of carbon taxes, particularly in Canada, where we've had a Supreme Court ruling saying that the federal government has the right to enforce this, now these companies are really, like I said, carrot and stick, looking at how they're going to reduce their emissions, because otherwise they're going to be paying carbon taxes, and the carrot being as well that the provincial and federal governments have all come up with very attractive incentive programs where they'll provide grants for up to 50 to 75% of the cost of these plants to install them. So it makes it very attractive, both from a carrot and from a stick perspective, that something should be done in the near future.
Right. On that topic, that's a good segue here. Peter, in terms of what governments you're seeing taking the lead in this, in this whole process here, and maybe expand upon, you touched on some of the incentives, Jeff just touched on some of the incentives, anything investors should be aware of there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, here in Canada, there's a bit of a patchwork quilt of regulations, but as Jeffrey said, at the federal level, we have the carbon backstop, the main part of which is actually carbon pricing. So if you have operations in Canada and you emit over a certain threshold, you are going to be subject to either directly regulated based on the output-based pricing system, which means you'll have a certain amount of CO2 you can emit per ton of product, or you're going to be subject to the carbon levy. So in other words, fossil fuels will be taxed, and that increase in costs will make its way to you, regardless of whether or not you're paying the tax or the fuel distributor who's giving you your fuel is paying the tax. So certainly there are governments taking the lead on this. Their provinces can have their own system. That is, if it's deemed equivalent to the feds, they can have their own system instead of the federal backstop. And many provinces have. So certainly every single province in Canada is subject to some form of carbon pricing, whether it's the federal backstop or whether it's a provincial regulation. And what we're seeing is more and more of that worldwide. So back in the early 1990s, there were two countries, Sweden and I think Norway, who had a carbon tax. Now there's 70 countries globally who have some form of carbon taxing, whether it's a carbon tax or whether it's a cap and trade system, so some form of carbon pricing. The European Union emissions trading system has been operating now since 2007, and it covers over 11,000 large final emitters, and sometimes there's even a carbon tax layered on that as well. So really, there are increasingly government regulations around this, which is certainly driving interest in technologies like ponds. However, I think the bigger driver is actually going to be some of these net zero targets that banks and pension funds and investors are starting to implement. So just like Jeffrey said, the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund is a great example. They have committed to being net zero by 2050. They have also committed to interim targets where they're going to decarbonize their investments by 30% by 2025. How are they going to do that if not by selling some of their investments that are related to high polluting industries and buying those that aren't, or at least starting to engage in a very serious way with those that are high polluting, whether they're assets they currently own or whether that's incorporated into any kind of an investment decision they're going to make going forward. So this is not something that's going away. This is not something that can be lobbied away from governments. This is not something that companies can ignore. If we look at the sum total emission reductions required if we are to meet the ambition of the Paris Climate Agreement signed in 2015 that, in theory, commits the world to an ambition of keeping global warming within 2 degrees of Celsius. Emissions need to fall off a cliff in the next decade, and that's going to push a kind of market transformation that's really almost unprecedented. And that market transformation, in terms of the reduction in emissions, in terms of the change of what investors will be investing in terms of a change of where governments will be regulating, that's going to drive massive uptake in the industry and hopefully make big winners out of companies like Jeffries and Pond Technologies.
Let's sort of bring that closer to home, Jeff, if we could here. I think in your slide deck, there's, about 1,000 facilities. I think Peter mentioned numbers similar to that, that are sort of emitters of, large emitters, 10 to 20 kiloton per year of CO2, just within Canada. When you think of the size of the market in Canada alone, what do you sort of see there? What is the opportunity?
Well, it is huge. I mean, that is right. We say that every smokestack in the world is our potential customer, and even in Canada, even if we were to get 10%, the average plant, for example, if it's a large scale plant, can be $50 million to $100 million. So if you even got 10%, and you can do the math yourself, you can see that it's multi-billions of dollars in just Canada. Delta itself has offices worldwide. We're also dealing in the UK. We have an office there. We have an office in China. We have an office in the UAE. We have an office in the United States. So we're attempting to attract all of these markets worldwide and try to establish ourselves there with as being the leader in CO2 capture. We don't actually manufacture ourselves. We are a process design engineering company. So we take the CO2 capture process that we've developed over the last many years. And then what we do is we use local fabricators to take the best advantage of the local conditions. So for example, if you're dealing in China, we have relationships with people there. So these companies then can take advantage of a lower costs of fabrication, for example, and building our plants. And then they can do the installation. They would have the knowledge about, what's required from a standards from electrical and mechanical perspective and all those things. So we see this as a very huge market. We're gearing up as fast as we can and adding people and locations, and very excited about the potential of the market, particularly in markets that were mentioned that, have a carbon tax, so that really do have a real stick that's going to force these emitters to do something in the near future.
Perfect. Peter, maybe that's a good transition to talk a little bit more specifically about each of your companies and your technologies there. Expand a little bit further on Pond Technologies and the applications that it is that you are bringing to the market here.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So Pond Technologies, we build things that you can think of as something like a big aquarium. So we're going to take your stack gas, what would normally just go up your main smokestack. We're going to bubble it through a big tank. And as we're bubbling it through a tank, we're using artificial LED lights, a combination of some controls, some sensors, some nutrient blends. And we're growing algae within that tank. As the algae grow, it grows no different from how trees or forests or anything else that undertakes photosynthesis grows. It absorbs CO2 and turns it into something like plant matter. Algae, there is approximately 1 million species of algae that we could grow worldwide. Of those, there are probably about 250,000 that have been described by science and identified. Of those, there's about 15 that are grown commercially worldwide for various food and animal feed and nutraceutical ingredients. So the opportunities in terms of product development, when you compare something like terrestrial crops to algae, is astonishing. We can grow algae with almost 70% protein content as a source of sustainable alternative protein for either human consumption or animal feeds. We can grow other high value pigments, dyes, different industrial chemicals as well. So, for us, the only thing limiting the amount of CO2 we can absorb is growing the algae markets for the products that come out. So for us, an ideal system that we can work with is a system that burns something that's relatively clean. So perhaps something that combusts natural gas or an ethanol plant or a fertilizer plant where you've got a pretty pure stream of CO2 coming out. And that just means that everything can be food grade and we can sell this as a high protein alternative or a animal feed or a human feed ingredient. We can work with other folks too on things like fertilizers, but just having a clean source of CO2 helps. And then anyone who has a pretty consistent source of CO2 is a good target for us as well. So somebody who's emitting CO2 constantly. And other than that, you're really looking at roughly 2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions we can turn into 1 ton of algae. That algae can sell from anywhere between $2 or $3 a kilogram, or 2,000 or 3,000 per ton, to up to 15,000 per ton, depending on the markets you're selling it into. So you can quickly see how the sale of algae becomes a very profitable enterprise, and that's going to drive us installing more facilities and absorbing more CO2.
And then Jeff, same on sort of your side. You just mentioned a moment ago, you're not necessarily building plants, but you're a processing design and engineering sort of a firm. Talk a little bit about your business model and the applications that you're providing for the market here.
Sure, thanks very much. As you can see behind me there, that's a sort of a graphic example of what a commercial scale CO2 capture plant could be. And like I said, it can be anywhere from capturing 1 ton a day up to, we've designed plants for large coal plants, for example, for up to 7,000 to 9,000 tons a day. So you can see this is large commercial scale CO2. And the way this whole process works is you could, one of those columns there, for example, is what we call the absorber column. And what happens is you run the flue gas from your emission source through the bottom of that column, and it percolates up. And then what you do is you drop what we call a commercial solvent down there, which can be usually an amine-based solvent with various other mixtures depending on the type of flue gas. So we can really take any kind of flue gas, whether it be coal flue gas, steel plant, natural gas plant, doesn't matter. Anything, any kind of flue gas. We would design a solvent for that particular situation that would absorb, it can be up to 100% of the CO2 if you want, but the most efficient is usually around 95 to 98% of the CO2 can be removed. Then that solvent that's been absorbed, the CO2 that's been absorbed in that solvent, then goes to the other, what we call the stripper columns, which is the other side of the graphic behind me. And then what happens is that we add heat to that solvent and the CO2 then boils off. And then the solvent itself returns back to the top of the original absorber column, and that whole process continues. So there's also in the middle there a technology that we've developed, which is called a solvent reclaimer. And what it does is it acts like a human kidney, is that we take a portion of that solvent on an ongoing basis, we put it through this reclaimer system that we've developed. And then what that does is, just like your kidney does in your body and the blood in your body, it purifies the solvent, and then it brings it back into the working system again, so that you're always running top quality solvent and you're always getting maximum efficiency with your system. That CO2, once it's been captured, then it's pure. You can compress it, you can ship it for whatever purposes you want. I mean, the largest user of CO2 right now is what we call enhanced oil recovery. It's where they put CO2 down into an old oil well, and then by putting the CO2 down there, it makes the oil more miscible, which means that it can flow a lot better. And then so for every ton of CO2, they found that you can get from 6 to 8 barrels of additional oil. And that's been a major use of CO2 in provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta right now in the oil industry. You can also use it for food grade CO2, like was mentioned. It's such after it comes out of our system, it's in such a quality. It doesn't matter whether it's coal flue gas or natural gas. It's totally pure. And then it can be used for human consumption. So we've done projects, for example, whereby Coke and Pepsi and other breweries like Heidelberg, for example, have used our technology, and they use it for carbonation in products like pop or beer or any of those other products that require food grade carbonation. So there's lots of uses. Recently, we did a project in Calgary with a power plant there, Shepherd Power Plant, which the government and the Canadian heavy oil producers sponsored what they call an X Prize competition. And this competition was a competition whereby they went out and they went to the world and said, you know, what do you want to do with your CO2? Give us your best proposals. And there was over 100 companies that came in and said, we're going to do everything from carbon nanotubes to ethanol and methanol production to injecting CO2 into concrete to make it lighter and stronger. And out of all these things, these are some more of these very necessary technologies that are needed other than for enhanced oil recovery, in which you can actually use CO2 for commercial products. And so we were pleased to be selected as the company that was providing the CO2 capture technology from a large natural gas turbine, and then providing it to these various competitors for the use of the CO2 for building their own commercial CO2 capture products.
In sort of some of the time that we have left here, let's, next I want to chat a little bit about the patent portfolios for both of you guys. Peter, maybe starting off with you here, talk about the uniqueness of the offering that you have and the protection from patent perspective.
Yeah, first I'll just take a quick moment to thank Jeffrey for bringing up the X Prize. Pond was in fact a semifinalist in the X Prize, meaning of the roughly 200 or so companies that entered, we were one of the top 10 in the world selected to go through to the semifinals. In terms of our patent portfolio, we have a pretty significant patent portfolio, really based on the sensors, controls that we use that enable the use of stack gas. So there's lots of other companies out there that grow algae. Right now they grow it outdoors in open ponds. There's even publicly traded companies like Cyanotech in Hawaii that grow algae for various food and feed markets. So we're not the only company growing algae, but our technology is unique, and it's unique in two ways. It's unique, first of all, because we don't use outdoor open ponds. Never have, never will. We use enclosed tanks, and we use sensors and control technologies to get roughly 10 times the amount of productivity per liter of water in the tank as compared to an outdoor open system. So we're sort of like comparing growing out in a field to a highly tuned and automated greenhouse production system. Our patents around that, we have a core of about 5 or 6 U.S. Trade and Patent Office applications, of which 4 have been fully granted. Those applications were repeated in selected different claim bundlings globally. We have 2 fully granted patents in the European Union, 2 fully granted patents in the Gulf Cooperation Council, 1 fully granted patent in China, along with selected other patents, over 100 in total in various PCT, non-PCT countries worldwide. If anybody else is using the stack gas from an industrial emitter to grow not just algae, any kind of organism that uses photosynthesis, you cannot do that without violating our patent portfolio.
Jeff, maybe the same on your side here as well. Talk about the uniqueness of the product offering and what it is you're bringing to the market and any protection surrounding it.
Yes, thank you. The post-combustion CO2 capture process is a process that I understand the original patents were granted about 98 years ago. So it's a process that's been around a long time, and it's very well known and very commercial. Most of the large CO2 capture projects in the world are using a variation of the type of technology that we're currently using. We're the largest company in Canada that does this particular process. There's lots of others that have various variations of it. Our particular patent process revolves not so much around the columns and that, but more on the reclaimer system that I was talking about earlier. We've got worldwide patents on the reclaimer, and we've got a very interesting process that's very efficient in cleaning up the mixed solvents right now that are being used, because in the past they may have used straight amines, but now the new blends of solvents that are used in the capture process have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you'll probably see other companies like Mitsubishi and Fluor and others talk about their patented solvent technology. And really what it is just an amine with various blends of other additives that make the capture process more efficient. And what our reclaimer does is it's a vacuum reclaimer, and it allows us to adjust the temperature in the vacuum so that when you're reclaiming the solvent, they have different boiling points of those solvents. and as a result, straight amine may be at a certain temperature, and then the other additives may be at this temperature. So we can adjust the temperatures that allow us to reclaim almost 100% of the solvent to bring it back. And that's very critical in the process, because you want to reduce your operating costs on an ongoing basis. And one of your biggest operating costs is your continuing, if you have to continue to replace solvents, and if you don't effectively manage their purity on an ongoing basis, then your plant, after a very short period of time, is going to be polluted with all of the things that are found in normal flue gases. Like, for example, in a coal plant, you'll see particulates, you'll see sulfurs, you'll see other things that come in that create things like what we call heat stable salts and other pollutants that very quickly will make your plant not work very well. And certainly, they saw a lot of that happening in the large plant that Shell built in Boundary Dam, where it wasn't correctly designed reclaimer. So this technology is very critical. We've also looked at various ways and that you can improve the operating capabilities and the way you design your plant. We've found that from what we design to actually what actually ends up being a commercial operation, that we're within 3 to 5% of average deviation of the actual plant performance for what we design. So we're very confident in our ability to design a plant that's going to work commercially for you as your customer, and that's going to operate efficiently and without a lot of problems. And that's different from a lot of the other companies that are going around and claiming they can do this and that, and really, a lot of them are science experiments, and we like to say that we're more commercial than that.
Got it. In just the few minutes we have left here, let's kind of bring this kind of full circle here. We've talked about the market opportunity. We've talked about your companies. Peter, as we sit here today, what are the biggest hindering factors to what I think most people are expecting, sort of this rapid adoption of various technologies in this industry being deployed?
For us, it is undoubtedly the buyers for algae biomass. So in other words, our technology is something that can reduce CO2 emissions, and we can make your CO2 emissions go away in a profitable way, but only if we have people interested in buying the algae. So there are several major companies out there, including shout out to one of our big partners, AB Associated British Foods, and their subsidiary AB Agri, who we're working with on animal feed ingredients from algae. But for sure, I don't think Pond is going to be limited in its growth by trying to find sources of CO2 emissions. Sources of CO2 emissions are everywhere. We are going to be somewhat limited by trying to find different nutraceutical companies, as well as feed ingredient companies, alternative protein companies who are willing to use algae in their final products and set up commercial contracts with us to do that.
And Jeff, maybe also just kind of putting a final point here. What are the risks to not enacting some of these technologies on a global basis that we're sort of discussing here today?
Well, I think we both talked about it a little bit earlier, is the fact that, with the carrots and sticks that are happening right now, if you don't act, you're really going to be negligent to your investors, particularly if you've made net zero commitments to your shareholders and to your existing investors and potentially new investors. If the teacher's pension fund wrote you a $30 million investment check or $100 million investment check for a big oil company and you don't do anything about it, then, what does that mean from a liability perspective? I don't know. I mean, I think, particularly in Canada, both the governments, both parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, have committed to emissions reduction. So I don't think that the companies can sit on their hands anymore about this. And they're proving that they're being very responsible. I mean, like I said, I've never seen as much inquiries in my life as I've seen over the last year. It's truly amazing. I probably see in 1 month what I saw in 5 years and as far as potential projects. Now, are all those going to translate into business? We're working hard on that right now and doing lots of proposals. And, I guess we're going to have to see, our biggest challenge really is, it's not capturing the CO2, but what do you do with it at the end of the day? And certainly by having, algae technologies or other technologies that can then use the CO2, that's going a long way to make this into a commercial proposition. And that's the biggest challenge. Is it going to cost me money to capture CO2, or am I going to make money? Even if I can break even, I think all these guys would be very, very happy, very happy. So my job is to show them a commercial capture technology, but my job is also to show them what do you do with the CO2 at the end of the day, and what potential grants you might be able to use to help subsidize the cost of your project. And that's, if you had to wrap it all up, that's my job, and that's how I'm going to make this work for our company and for other companies.
Fantastic. I think we're just at the end of our session here. Peter, any sort of final comments before we depart?
No, I think Jeffrey did a really good job there of summarizing why companies can't ignore their carbon dioxide emissions and their greenhouse gas emissions. It's just not going to be possible. We talked a little bit earlier about the Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are going to be setting 5-year rolling plans for how they will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Canada has already committed to a 40 to 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. 2030 is in less than 8 years, and our emissions are going up, not going down. So something there is going to give, and my suspicion is there's going to be a lot more deployment of technologies like ours, a lot more and higher government pricing and government policies around this, and a lot more investor interest that will force folks to act.
Jeff, I'll give you the final word.
Well, I want to invite anybody that wants to find out a little bit more about emissions reduction on a commercial scale by visiting our website, deltacleantech.ca. Very pleased to introduce you to our team and help you with what your particular case is. Every capture situation is different. Depending on what utilities you have available to you, whether you've got cooling water or whether you've got to do air coolers or whether you've got steam available or you got to generate your own steam. So, it's not like that you can just kind of build a coffee cup and sell it to everybody. It's different in every situation. And us as an engineering company, that's what we do. And we custom design every plant for a situation to optimize it, make sure that it works according to our design. And so we'll help you with that, and also with the grants and everything else you need to make it happen.
Let's leave it there. Peter, Jeff, thank you very much for your time today. I think we all came away with a good deal of knowledge here. I'll say this also to the audience. If anyone would like to get in touch with either of our panel participants and I can help to coordinate, please let me know. Send me an email. It's bloom@lythampartners.com. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the conference. Jeff, Peter, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Real pleasure.